December 27th, 2025. The Southern Caribbean appeared calm, almost too calm. With only days left before the year came to a close, commercial traffic was still moving at a steady pace. Fishing boats followed their usual routes, while cargo vessels stayed locked into familiar shipping lanes. From the surface, it looked like an ordinary transit window, the kind many people might associate with lower operational tension. That was exactly the impression Venezuela seemed to be relying on. From Caracas, the timing may have looked perfect. Late December, holiday rotations, end-of-year fatigue. A quiet assumption that United States Navy crews, like everyone else, might be working under a slower, more predictable rhythm. Not unprepared, just easier to read. At 6:18 local time, that assumption began to fall apart. High above the water, United States Navy sensors detected a shift in the surface picture. 6 separate contacts, previously spread apart, were now aligning. Their speed increased, their headings narrowed. What had looked like routine background movement on radar suddenly formed into something coordinated. This was not random traffic, and it was not a coincidence. Inside the carrier's operations center, the picture became clear fast. Hull profiles, radar activity, displacement, and maneuver patterns all pointed to Venezuelan naval vessels. These ships were not simply drifting closer, they were moving with purpose. Closest point of approach, calculations updated second by second. The distance decreased, then decreased again. On the bridge, there were no raised voices and no dramatic change of course. The aircraft carrier continued forward, holding both speed and heading exactly as procedure required. Because December does not change discipline, the United States Navy does not operate with a holiday mindset. Readiness does not rise and fall with the calendar. Watch rotations remain fixed, response levels stay consistent. Every transit, whether in July or in the final days of December, is treated the same by design. That was the first mistake in Venezuela's calculation. At 6:24, bridge-to-bridge radio calls were sent out. The message was professional and direct. First in English, then in Spanish. Standard maritime notices identified a United States Navy vessel conducting lawful operations in international waters. No reply came back. The 6 Venezuelan ships kept closing in. Their formation then separated into 2 groups. It was a familiar pressure move. One element shifted toward the carrier's port side, while the other angled toward starboard. It was not a full surround. Not yet. But it was close enough to test the carrier group's response limits. Across the carrier group, the picture widened. Escort destroyers made small position adjustments, not to provoke, but to improve coverage. Air search radars narrowed their attention. Surface tracks were refined with enough detail to separate individual wake patterns. Every change in speed, every steering correction from the approaching ships was recorded. Still, the carrier did not turn. This is the part many people outside naval operations often misunderstand. Holding course under pressure does not mean being passive. In United States Navy procedure, staying steady can be the strongest signal of control. By 6:31, the Venezuelan ships increased speed again. That choice mattered. It moved the encounter beyond routine proximity and into the territory of a deliberate challenge. This was no longer simple shadowing. It was a test of distance, patience, and whether the date on the calendar would buy them extra tolerance. It would not. Without spectacle, the next phase began. An MH-60R Seahawk helicopter was moved into readiness status. It was configured for observation, not confrontation. Its task was simple: maintain eyes forward, keep a continuous record, and make its presence unmistakable. No dramatic signals were sent. No loud warnings filled the air, but every sailor on watch understood the weight of the moment. The Venezuelan Navy had chosen its timing carefully. December 27th, just days before the new year. A moment they believed the United States Navy would be at its most predictable, perhaps even at its least prepared. They were about to discover that preparation does not take holidays and that calm seas can sometimes hide the boldest assumptions. From the outside, the United States aircraft carrier appeared to be alone. That illusion was part of the mistake. To anyone watching from miles away, it looked like a single dark silhouette moving through the quiet Caribbean water. No escorts crowded the horizon. No sudden turns broke its course. No visible signs suggested a heightened posture. Just steel, steady movement, and silence. But what the Venezuelan ships could not see was everything beneath that calm surface. By 6:36 local time, the carrier group had shifted into a layered awareness posture. It was not panic. It was not a rushed reaction. It was controlled, deliberate, and far more serious for anyone reading the situation incorrectly. Inside the operations center, the surface picture had become much more than 6 contacts on a screen. It was now a living model of movement and intent. Course projections, speed changes, formation behavior, and likely next steps were all being analyzed in real time. each Venezuelan vessel was tracked separately, its actions compared against past encounters and known naval patterns. Patterns matter, and these patterns did not look routine. The United States Navy does not wait for a close visual encounter before thinking several moves ahead. The sensors begin that work first. Radar sweeps sharpen the surface tracks into precise movement lines. Electronic monitoring systems recorded emissions from Venezuelan radar sets as they moved through search patterns. Nothing dramatic, nothing that crossed a formal line, but enough to show that the ships were actively watching and measuring the carrier group. That single detail changed the tone of the entire encounter. On the bridge, the carrier held its heading without adjustment. Its speed remained unchanged. The instruction was clear: make no move that could be mistaken for doubt. At the same time, the rest of the carrier group quietly came into focus, not visually, but tactically. Escort destroyers adjusted their spacing with precision. These were not sweeping movements across miles of ocean. They were small, measured shifts across hundreds of yards, creating overlapping coverage zones around the carrier without turning the scene into a display. This was not meant to impress anyone. It was geometry. Above the formation, an MH-60R Seahawk lifted into the air. Its departure was smooth and unhurried. Through binoculars, it might have looked like a routine launch, but its purpose was exact. The helicopter pushed the carrier's awareness farther outward, sending back real-time imagery, surface identification, and behavioral confirmation. Every second of footage was time-stamped. Every bearing was logged. Every maneuver was preserved. This was not about making a scene. It was about creating a record. At 6:41, another set of bridge-to-bridge radio calls went out. The voice was calm and professional, repeating safe navigation protocols and identifying the United States Navy carrier as operating lawfully in international waters. Once again, there was no answer. The Venezuelan ships kept moving closer, their wakes growing sharper as their speed increased. One vessel edged slightly ahead of the rest, taking the role of a lead element. It was not direct enough to trigger formal response procedures, but it was clear enough to show intent. Inside the carrier, no one raised their voice. That silence was not hesitation, it was discipline. The late December timing had not lowered readiness. If anything, it made the process even more predictable in the best possible way. Watch teams were fully staffed. Air crews were rested. Command personnel were operating under normal peacetime transit procedures. The same procedures built to absorb pressure without letting the situation spiral. That was what Venezuela had not accounted for. United States Navy readiness does not suddenly appear only during a crisis. It stays steady. At 0647, the Seahawk moved closer while keeping a safe offset from the Venezuelan formation. Its sensors did the talking. Infrared cameras followed exhaust patterns. Optical systems captured deck activity. Crew movement near forward defensive positions was noted, not as an immediate concern, but as context. No systems were aimed, no bright warning signals appeared yet, just observation. This is where miscalculations often begin to build on themselves. When one side expects a visible reaction and receives none, it may decide to push further, mistaking calm for limitation and silence for uncertainty. But capability was everywhere. Below the waterline, passive monitoring systems maintained awareness. Above the surface, air search radars continued their sweep. Beyond the horizon, data links connected the carrier to a wider network stretching far beyond what the Venezuelan ships could see or understand. From their perspective, it may have looked like 6 ships challenging one carrier near the end of the year. From the United States Navy's perspective, it was a familiar pressure scenario unfolding exactly as training had prepared them for. And the closer the Venezuelan ships came, the clearer one fact became: they were not exposing weakness. They were moving deeper into a system designed to observe, contain, and outlast pressure without turning the moment into open confrontation. By 0652 local time, the encounter reached its turning point. The Venezuelan formation was now close enough that assumptions no longer mattered. Distance was no longer just a calculation on a screen. It could be read in visual range, wake overlap, and the subtle behavior of ships that had shifted from signaling to pressure. This was the moment when intent either becomes clear or begins to fall apart. Inside the carrier's operations center, the assessment was unified. The Venezuelan ships had moved beyond passive presence and into a deliberate challenge. Not an open confrontation, not yet, but unmistakably unsafe. That distinction mattered. Response procedures are not shaped by emotion or appearance. They are shaped by thresholds. And one of those thresholds is proximity combined with behavior. Venezuela reached that threshold at 0655. The MH-60R Seahawk adjusted its orbit. The helicopter descended slightly, keeping lateral separation while tightening its observation arc. From that position, its sensors delivered continuous high-resolution coverage of the Venezuelan lead vessel's bridge, deck activity, and forward defensive mount. Everything was recorded. Everything was time-stamped. This was not about pressure. It was about proof. On the carrier's bridge, the posture remained unchanged. Course steady, speed constant, no public-facing alarm, no visible movement of defensive systems. The message was deliberate. The United States Navy would not be pulled into a reaction. That refusal to react was the reaction. At 0658, the Seahawk began the next step in the controlled response sequence, one designed specifically to avoid open confrontation. A low-power, non-contact optical designator activated briefly. Its light passed across the bridge windows of the Venezuelan ship. It was not overpowering. It was not reckless. But it was impossible to miss. Every experienced mariner understands what a signal like that means. You have been seen, you are being recorded, and you are moving toward a boundary that should not be crossed. At the same time, the helicopter crew transmitted a direct warning over open maritime frequencies, first in English, then in Spanish. The voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. You are operating unsafely in international waters. Alter course immediately. For the first time since the encounter began, the movement aboard the Venezuelan ships changed. Not in speed, but in posture. Deck crews shifted position. Personnel stepped away from the forward defensive mount. Someone on the bridge raised binoculars, held them for a moment, then lowered them again. These were small details. But at sea, small details can speak loudly. Inside the carrier group, no one celebrated. No one relaxed. This was the most delicate phase of the encounter, the moment when pride, politics, and misreading the situation can overlap. The carrier still did not turn. That was not stubbornness. It was procedure. If the carrier changed course under pressure, it would give meaning to the Venezuelan maneuver. It would suggest that timing and proximity could influence United States Navy movement. That was not a precedent the carrier group would allow. At 0702, one of the Venezuelan ships reduced speed. Not by much, but enough to be noticed. The formation lost its balance. The lead vessel began to drift slightly offline. Another ship started falling behind by a growing margin. The unity that had defined the approach began to weaken. That was the moment the challenge began to fail. Not through noise, not through spectacle, but through hesitation. The Seahawk held its position, sensors steady, saying nothing. The optical signal did not return. The radio remained quiet. The United States Navy did not push the moment further. That restraint carried weight because everyone involved understood what had just happened. Venezuela had moved to the edge, expecting late December complacency. Instead, it encountered disciplined silence, layered awareness, and a carrier that refused to treat pressure as leverage. At 0706, the Venezuelan formation changed course. Not officially a withdrawal, but no longer an intercept either. The closest point of approach began to widen, slowly at first, then with clear intent. The line had been reached, and Venezuela had chosen not to cross it. No dramatic action followed, no warnings rose to a new level, no orders echoed across the deck, but the message was impossible to miss. December 27th was supposed to be a moment of distraction. Instead, it became a demonstration of something far easier to underestimate. A Navy that does not need to raise the temperature to assert control and does not need the calendar to remind it to stay ready. The encounter was not finished, but the outcome had already been shaped. By 0711 local time, the geometry of the situation had changed. Not sharply, not suddenly, but enough that anyone trained to read the sea could see it. The Venezuelan ships were no longer pressing forward. Their headings had softened. Their wake lines, once sharp and converging, had begun to spread apart. Distance was returning, 1 nautical mile at a time. Inside the United States Carriers Operations Center, the surface picture continued updating. Closest point of approach values widened. Speed differences returned toward normal. What had looked like a challenge only minutes earlier was now something else entirely. Containment. The carrier group did not pursue, it did not close distance. It did not turn the moment into a display. That too was deliberate. In United States Navy procedure, once pressure is relieved, the rise in tension stops. There is no advantage in forcing the other side to look embarrassed. Control is the objective, not spectacle. From the Venezuelan perspective, this was the moment of realization. The holiday assumption had failed. December had not weakened readiness. It had not thinned watch teams. It had not slowed decision-making. Instead, it had revealed a steady system operating exactly as designed, indifferent to timing, unmoved by appearances, and resistant to provocation. As the Venezuelan ships opened separation, the structure they had misjudged became clearer. The aircraft carrier had never been alone. Escort destroyers, previously masked by distance and geometry, now appeared more clearly on radar. Their spacing formed a protective arc that had been there from the beginning, unseen but constant. Above them, the Seahawk remained on station, not as a threat, but as proof that every second of the encounter was preserved on record. Beyond the immediate formation, data links connected the carrier to a wider operational picture. Assets outside visual range continued monitoring air and surface movement. Nothing about this encounter existed in isolation. That understanding settled in quietly. At 0716, one Venezuelan ship made a more noticeable course correction. Another followed. The formation no longer looked like a coordinated maneuver. It looked like individual vessels returning to routine patrol headings. No announcement came with the change, no radio message, no acknowledgement of the warning. That too was normal. Navies rarely admit miscalculation in real time. They adjust, disengage, and move on. The United States carrier maintained its course the entire time. No victory turn, no signal flare, no added tension. The carrier continued its transit as though nothing unusual had happened. Operationally, that was the point. Pressure scenarios are expected. They are trained for, measured, and absorbed. By 0721, the closest Venezuelan ship was opening distance at a steady rate. 6 nautical miles, then 7. The area of concern narrowed back into safe margins. What remained was documentation, review, and an encounter that would later be studied in quiet rooms far from the water. On the bridge, the tone never changed. Logs were updated, timestamps were verified, sensor recordings were archived. The Seahawk prepared to return to the deck, its mission complete. The most revealing detail was not what happened. It was what did not happen. No dramatic alarm. No sudden shift in posture. No departure from procedure. Venezuela had tested what it believed was a moment of weakness. Instead, it encountered a system designed to operate without emotional highs, seasonal lows, or gaps created by the calendar. That was the reality they had missed. Readiness is not a temporary surge, it is the baseline. By the time the Venezuelan ships fully disengaged, one fact was clear, not only to the sailors involved, but also to the analysts who would later examine every frame and every data point. December 27th had not revealed complacency, it had revealed assumption. The carrier group continued southbound, steady and unchanged, leaving behind calm water and a lesson written not in noise, but in distance regained and pressure dissolved. The encounter was over. The implications were not. By the time the Venezuelan ships had fully separated, the sea had returned to its earlier calm. No debris, no dramatic warning display, no real-time headlines. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had happened. Inside the United States Navy system, everything had happened. Every radar sweep, every course change, every pause, and every adjustment had already been archived, sorted, and prepared for post-mission review. Not as drama, not as spectacle, as data. That is where the real outcome of December 27th was decided. For Venezuela, the encounter appeared to be a calculated signal, a late-year challenge built around the idea that timing could create leverage. The assumption was simple. A holiday window might create uncertainty, and carefully applied proximity might draw a visible reaction. Instead, it exposed a misunderstanding of how the United States Navy operates. Readiness is not seasonal. There is no holiday posture at sea. Watch rotations do not thin out. Decision chains do not slow down. Procedure does not pause for calendars, celebrations, or fatigue. The same standards that apply in midsummer apply on December 27th. The same thresholds govern behavior, no matter how the moment appears from the outside. That consistency is intentional. A system that only sharpens itself during obvious tension invites miscalculation during quiet moments. The United States Navy is built to avoid that trap. The Venezuelan ships did not fail because they were outmatched in visible strength. They failed because they misread restraint. They mistook silence for uncertainty. They assumed calm water meant lowered vigilance. It did not. What they met was a carrier group operating exactly as trained, absorbing pressure without overreacting, documenting behavior without raising the temperature, and allowing the situation to resolve without forcing a public outcome. That kind of control sends a message that lasts longer than spectacle. At every step, stronger options existed. They simply were not needed. No defensive systems had to be displayed, no maneuver had to be forced, no boundary had to be crossed, and yet control was never in doubt. That is the lesson of December 27th. In modern naval competition, control is not measured by who makes the loudest move first. It is measured by who sets the tempo without needing to make one at all, by who remains predictable to themselves, yet difficult for others to read. Venezuela tried to create leverage through timing. The United States Navy answered by refusing to treat timing as a weakness. That refusal matters. When a Navy operates the same way on December 27th as it does on any other day, it removes the openings others hope to find. In the hours that followed, the carrier group continued its transit. No change in mission, no public display, no signal beyond the one already delivered at sea. For the sailors involved, it was logged as another pressure scenario resolved without unnecessary escalation. For planners and analysts, it became something more, a reminder that miscalculation rarely announces itself loudly. More often, it arrives quietly, disguised as confidence in the wrong assumption. December 27th was supposed to be a moment of advantage. Instead, it became a case study. Not in spectacle, not in open confrontation, but in why assuming complacency inside a professional navy is one of the surest ways to discover there is none. The sea remained calm. The lesson did not.